Afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The afternoon panel today is going to address the topic, how do we leverage the network to build maritime power? As you take your seats, as we normally do, we ask you to turn off your electronic devices. And as a reminder, before we get started, you'll see microphones in the aisle here, and therefore our question and answers, once the panel's completed some of their remarks, I know we'll have an opportunity for question and answers. My name is Bob Wood. I'm Executive Vice President, AFCEA International, and on behalf of USNI and AFCEA, we'd like to welcome you here this afternoon to a panel addressing a very vital topic. We've heard a discussion about the network, about connectivity. In fact, Admiral Richardson, the CNO, has talked about using the power of the network as we build the fleet to the number of ships and platforms we need. It was only right that we talk about then how the network can be used and how we leverage it to be used to augment maritime power. I'd like to thank, as you see our banner here, we'd like to thank CSRA for sponsoring the afternoon session. They are represented here by Mr. Ken Deutsch. Thank you very much for being with us today, Executive Vice President of CSRA's Defense Group. As you know, we cannot hold these events without the support of our industry partners. Thank you to CSRA for helping us host this important discussion. I have the pleasure next to introduce my boss. Have to be careful here. He is a remarkable leader, has taken AFCEA, I think, to an incredibly good and stable place. In partnership with our USNI partner, we've built, I think, a show that has provided to you the types of dialogue and service we hope you find valuable. Bob Shea has been with us at AFCEA over 3 years. He was J6 on the Joint Staff. He was J6 in PACOM. He commanded Signal Forces, Desert Storm, and has trained an entire cohort of signal leaders. I'm always amazed by the number of people that Bob knows across really the military. And he drew together a panel. I'll let him do the introductions. But for certain, we have a great leader, a good communicator, and someone we respect very, very much in our AFCEA family for his leadership and dynamism in moving a lot of different projects forward. Bob, is that enough adjectives at this point? Is that good? We're thankful for that you're with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Bob Shea and our panel to the stage.
Well, thank you very much. These certainly are interesting times, and I think the delivery of the National Military Strategy that came out last week certainly, as was mentioned by Admiral Swift, is certainly a relevant document, and I refer to it as a document that prepares us, or is trying to prepare us or shape the strategy for the world as it is, not a world as we wish it was. It's really a document that calls into questions a lot of challenging issues that we have to deal with going forward. For us to be able to leverage the capabilities that have been developed and the capabilities that will be developed into the future, it's certainly important that we leverage the network. We've had it pretty much our own way over the last several decades, but in a lot of ways it's back to the future. A lot of the lessons learned that came out of the Cold War are certainly applicable going forward. You couple that with new technologies that are out there, and it is a challenging time. But the fact of the matter is that the operating forces, the people where the steel meets the target, are dependent now on a network that will be available, on a network that's resilient, and a network that will deliver the capabilities that we're going to need to carry on the next fight. Quite frankly, I think we can make some assumptions about the availability of that network, the challenges of that network, but the bottom line, where that network may be denied or degraded, is certainly going to put us in an environment that we don't want to be, because we probably better than anyone else, certainly better than anyone else, any other nation in the world, along with our coalition partners, have been able to leverage the capabilities and the strength that the network provides, the enabling of capabilities that the network provides. Not only that, it's not just about the network, but it's about the information and the data that goes across that network. It's about command and control, the ability to command and control the force, and to facilitate rapid, timely, and effective decisions. So we've got a great panel today that we can approach this topic from a lot of different directions. And so to get things started, I'm going to introduce them, and then they will give a short presentation, then we'll circle back, have some questions, and then we're going to open it up to the floor for you to ask this panel questions. They're all experts in their own right, and believe me, there's a lot of talent sitting up here, and I challenge you to challenge them with the questions as we go forward. Sitting to my immediate left is Mr. Ken Bible. As we sit here today, well, Friday, I guess it is, Ken will be the acting CIO for the Marine Corps. So we want to congratulate, I certainly want to congratulate Ken for that. Ken is a guy that has but more than that, he's a very pragmatic man, and he understands all the challenges that are out there. He knows how to leverage technology, but he doesn't know, I wouldn't say he's into leading technology, but he's not into bleeding technology. Would that be a fair statement, Ken? Sometimes it's bleeding, but we'll do a little triage if you need it. Okay. But anyway, his job right now will be, as I said, the CIO, but his job is to formulate and provide broad policy guidance in governing information technology, cybersecurity, and communications infrastructure and applications in support of the Marine Corps. He's got a program management engineering experience in terms of networking and C4I systems, and he led the engineering competency for the PEO EIS and provided the technical leadership in a portfolio that comprised over $2 billion in information technology. So Ken, I'm going to turn it over to you to get things started.
Okay, General, thank you very much for the kind remarks, and I appreciate everyone coming to this forum today. I look forward to your questions. Yes, when the General asked me to come, I was trying to think about what do we mean when we talk about generating combat power through the network, and certainly it's more than just about routers and switches and the connectivity that's being provided, but it's about information. And how do we leverage information in terms of this great peer competitor world that we're entering into? The National Defense Strategy sets this out very clearly in terms of who the pacing threat is, and we know that that's a threat that is operating very actively to develop these information-related capabilities. We have a short period of time in order to try to overmatch that and find the asymmetric advantage. Within the Marine Corps, we established this past summer a new 3-star, a new deputy commandant for information, so we're taking the question and the problem very seriously. He's very much informed by that pacing threat. I was very glad to hear Admiral Swift's remarks during lunch today, because I think that's a very relevant scenario in which he's working in, and it helps shape where we're going as a Marine Corps. General Dan O'Donohue is in that slot as the Deputy Commandant of Information, and he repeatedly talks about our need to be able to fight on and through the network. So let's think about what that means in the context of the strategies and concepts that the Marine Corps has. Based on the Marine Corps operational construct, concept document that our Capabilities Development and Integration Command came up with, we recognize that we're going to probably be the inside force. We're staying, right? So we're going to be in contact with those allies. We're working, doing theater security cooperation exercises and events all through the region there in the South China Sea, with Vietnam, with the Philippines, with other marine forces around the world. That's a part of our shaping operation. That's how we prepare the environment and shape the environment for cooperation if things advance to a different state. We have to recognize that we need to be prepared for these smaller distributed units of action to exist in that inside state. So think about this in the context of if I have a company level or battalion level team that's out there at an expeditionary advanced base operation, this EABO concept that you'll probably hear about in various readings. What does that mean in terms of the network? How do we maintain our ability to communicate? How do we maintain our ability to move data around? The introduction of the F-35 basically a flying sensor, right? Takes in more data per hour than probably most of our data centers could handle as a garrison-based infrastructure. But that's not where we're at. We're not a garrison force. We're forward deployed. We're in those small island chains with these expeditionary advanced bases. So how do we handle that? These are some of the challenges of building the network that we need. And building that network, building that persistence, that ability to communicate, that ability to do the analytics out on the edge, that's going to be our asymmetric advantage over an adversary, such as what we heard about from Admiral Swift. So I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ken. Next to Ken is Dr. Kelly Fletcher. Dr. Fletcher provides, she's the acting CIO for the Department of the Navy, and in that role, she provides guidance and direction to the CIO functional teams of cybersecurity, information technology, analysis, and internal controls, enterprise infrastructure, privacy and information sharing, strategy, and strategic spectrum policy. And I hope we can get into some of those questions about spectrum as we go forward here to achieve security and interoperability. One of the things you need to know about Dr. Fletcher's background is she spent some time in CAPE, so she understands the analysis and the rigor that has to go on. She's probably had many different good ideas thrown at her that she's been able to dismantle, perhaps, because they weren't properly thought through in many cases. But anyway, she has also been worked in the operations research analysis and command control communication and computer information technology programs at CAPE, as I said before. So she's very familiar with this topic. So she's been able to look at it from a warfighting perspective as well as from a CIO perspective, and has a good sense in how to integrate and tie all these together. Prior to that, she was an engineer at the URS Corporation and earned her doctorate from Georgia Tech. So she's certainly well qualified. She's got the experience. She's worked in the building. She's heard the argument. So I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Fletcher.
Thanks so much for the intro. So I wanted to focus today on the interface between business systems and tactical systems. This is, I think, one of the biggest risks we see coming at us right now. So I'm really interested in driving efficiency and accepting more risk in our business systems and our business networks, right? I think we can save money doing this and transfer that money to the warfighter and to the tactical edge. But something I'm seeing is a convergence of tactical and business networks and systems. And as these converge, it's hard for us to figure out where we're taking risk, right? And I think the difference between tactical and business networks and systems, there's two, I think, main difference. And one is our requirements, right? As the military, we have different requirements for these networks. And I don't want to say the business systems and business information isn't important, right? This is my social security number. It's how we get paid. It's really important. That being said, I think our requirements are very different for those systems and networks where we're doing C2, right? If we're doing C2, maybe we can't be down at all, right? If we're paying people, we all need to get paid, but I think there's a different requirement there. The other thing is I think that the government and the industry partner roles are a little different between these two networks. And I think right now we in the Navy are certainly trying to figure out how do we define who does what to who, what are my roles and responsibilities as the government, and what are industry's roles and responsibilities as we move to converging these networks. The key thing I'm really looking at right now is being really intentional about where we take risk, right? So let's take risk on our business side, and let's understand when that does affect our tactical side. So this is the area that I'm most interested in, but I look forward to any questions.
Okay, thank you very much. And next, Dr. Fletcher is Vice Admiral Matt Kohler. He's a career intelligence officer. He's the commander of Naval Information Forces. Matt has a vast experience between the operational and the tactical side of communications. He's been an intelligence analyst and a communication officer in the naval forces in Europe and London, a detailer, so he was a friend to everyone, I'm sure. Deputy Director of Intelligence J2 at Joint Warfare Analysis Center in Dahlgren, which is one of our gems and jewels. Director of Intelligence Operations for the Special Operations Command in Tampa, which I think we all recognize that is a key billet, and without strong intelligence capability, the targeting that gets done and the work that gets done by that community just doesn't happen. He's been the Director of Intelligence for the GIADF force in south and out of Key West, Florida. So he has worked in a joint environment in that regard as well. He has been the Commander of Naval Information Forces in Suffolk since its establishment in October 2014. And his other assignments included he was the J2 of U.S. Africa Command, as well as the Deputy Commander of Fleet Forces, Fleet Cyber Command, 10th Fleet. So, Admiral Kohler, it's over to you now. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. I probably need to delete the reference to being a detailer in my bio. As I say, I guess you never stop being a detailer until the bomb goes off in your car. But thanks. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here today and to share my thoughts with you. Kind of a fascinating topic here about how we leverage the network to build maritime power. And so I think you've heard two of my colleagues here so far talk about how they are defining and where they're coming at their definition of a network. So let me talk about from my perspective, but willing to entertain questions on any angle. To me, when we talk about networks from a Navy warfighting perspective, it does often, when you refer to networks, maybe often people default to an IP-based network kind of mindset. It is that for Navy warfighting, but it is much more than that. It is everything that allows our information to transmit around to where it needs to be. That includes our RF spectrum, SATCOM, our data links, anything that carries information that connects our sensors to our systems. It carries knowledge of our blue force, it carries the knowledge of red force, and enables us to be able to more than just enable decision making. It's part of the warfighting machine as we are evolving into now back into a contested environment. Let me offer the perspective that is being broadcasted by the Navy from two angles here. For those of you that were with me this morning when I had an opportunity to speak, I talked about the CNO's recent remarks about the 6 key dimensions that are needed for naval power. All are needed, not any one of them that oftentimes people talk about. It is a bigger Navy, it is a better Navy, a more talented Navy, a more agile Navy, a more ready Navy, and he highlights a network Navy. And he defines the network in his discussions is a fleet that can share data across the force and effectively leverage increased awareness. That's the warfighting network that we're talking about. Everything that consists of that capability is what I'm referring to when we talk about a network. The other angle is the network that's being described that's necessary for our warfighting that's coming out in a fleet design. It was signed out by Admiral Davidson just a few months ago. Most of it isn't classified, but essentially it talks about 3 key tenets of Navy warfighting that is moving away from a platform individual unit to multiple units. Think multiple strike groups that will be necessary in today's warfighting. 3 key tenets of that design is integration, distribution, and maneuver. Integration, more tightly bringing together our sensors and our weapon systems. The distribution, if you've heard of distributed lethality, it's how we're talking about operating the force in a much more distributed way. And maneuver, which can be talked about as physical maneuver, which is necessary. It used to be speed is life, now is if you don't move, you're dead. Is also a spectral maneuver. Us being able to maneuver all of our sensors, all of our spectrum, all of our networks in the face of a contested environment. All of those, integration, distribution, maneuver, stress everything that information warfare provides, but particularly how we operate our networks as a warfighting platform. I'll stop there. Those are the angle and perspectives that I would welcome any questions.
Thank you. Next is Rear Admiral Kevin Lunday, United States Coast Guard. He's the Assistant Commandant for C4 IT. And before we came out here, we were having a little bit of a discussion. I think as a nation, we really appreciate the great work and the vast role and the mission the United States Coast Guard has. It has a mission that takes it from the Arctic down to working in the littorals of the country, the JAVs. They've got to worry about the riverine operations. They've got to worry about the security of the locks. They've got to worry about the timing systems that are out there and the navigation systems that are out there. They've got a huge mission, and they do a great job on a day-to-day basis. And my sense is we just don't appreciate the depth and breadth of that mission. So I'd like to point that out to everyone here. Admiral Lunday commands the United States Coast Guard Cyber Command and serves as the Assistant Commandant for Command Control Communications, Computers, and Information Technology. He also is responsible for delivering effects in and through cyberspace to operate and defend Coast Guard networks, to enable the Coast Guard operations and protect it in maritime and the maritime information systems that it operates. From June of 14 until July of 2016, Admiral Lunday served as the Director for Exercise and Training, United States Cyber Command. So he's got a strong background in cyber, having been one of the principal staff officers at the United States Cyber Command. He's also been the commanding officer of the Coast Guard Maritime Intelligence Fusion Center, Atlantic. So what I think the important takeaway here is this guy's got a vast knowledge, a vast understanding of not just the threat, but from an operational perspective, what it takes and how important the networks are to the Coast Guard and the integration of the Coast Guard into the other military services. So I'll turn it over to you, Admiral.
Sir, thank you very much. Thank you for your comments on the Coast Guard. So welcome everyone, and I'd like to thank AFCEA and U.S. Naval Institute for hosting this tremendous forum. I'd like to particularly welcome the allies that are here, and I see several in the audience. And I think if we talk about leveraging networks to build maritime power, is I think one of the things that's an important theme is the importance of our allies and coalition. All warfare is coalition warfare, and the networks that we build on, that's a great example of the necessity of those networks and partnerships for maritime power. You know, I come at things and I'll explore it through a lens of cyberspace as an operational domain, as a domain of warfare, because I think that's particularly relevant when we talk about networks and the linkage to maritime power. In the May 2015 DoD cyber strategy, it declared that cyberspace was an operational domain, a domain of warfare. Within our own service, the Commandant, a month later, after about a year of study, released our own strategy that said the same thing, that for the Coast Guard, cyberspace is an operational domain. And when I say cyberspace, I mean it in the doctrinal sense. There are many different ways probably to define it, but in the joint doctrine sense of a physical, a logical, and a cyber persona layer. Now, when the Commandant said that, and when we heard it in strategy documents, and it's repeated in its own way in the recently released National Defense Strategy, it seems to make intuitive sense, although there can be debate about why that is. But I think there are a couple particular factors that are important to today's discussion as to why it is an operational domain, a domain of warfare. First of all, what we are seeing is a convergence of what happens in interdependence, growing interdependence, what happens in cyberspace and what happens in the classical physical domains, air, sea, space, and land. And that is happening because increasingly technology in those physical domains is networked in some way that links it into cyberspace. And so both risk and opportunity in the classic domains are tied to what happens in cyberspace. And because of that convergence, the reason that cyberspace is an operational domain is because it is not just a tough engineering problem, which it is. It's because it is now a realm of human interaction, cooperation, competition, and conflict, and warfare, just as the classic physical domains. And because of that, our understanding of networks and their relationship to power become much more than a discussion about technology. They become a discussion, and in fact, I would argue that the most important element in cyberspace is humans, people, and the most important networks in terms of power are human networks, not necessarily the logical and physical part, but the human part of it. And then its particular relevance for the joint force and our allies as well. If we think about some particular areas that the Coast Guard is focused on that I think are relevant to network and leveraging networks. First, it's our own role as part of the Joint Force. Of course, the Coast Guard is one of the 5 armed services and fully part of the Joint Force, although we sit within the Department of Homeland Security. But over the last year, based on an agreement between the Secretary of Defense and Secretary of Homeland Security just over a year ago, the Coast Guard is aligning itself and its networks and its cybersecurity and cyber operations with the Department of Defense. We are .mil. Our networks are part of DoD information networks. And that every day as Commander Coast Guard Cyber Command, I take authoritative direction and orders from U.S. Cyber Command and Commander Joint Force Headquarters DoD information networks on how to defend our part of the DoD information networks. And that's not just about our networks being part of the DoD. It's about our people in the Coast Guard and my crew of Coast Guard Cyber being organized, trained, and equipped to the same joint standards as the rest of the Department of Defense and the services. So, for example, the Coast Guard has a cyber protection team that maneuvers within our network to defend our network just as on the same standards as the 133 teams of the Department of Defense Cyber Mission Force. So in that sense, we are part of that joint network, not just the technology networks, but also the human networks that are part of the joint force. The other area I think that is particularly important to emphasize is that we are in the same process of modernizing as the rest of the Department of Defense. That begins with the Windows 10 deployment that we are ongoing right now across the Department of Defense. We're doing that within the Coast Guard. And we will see continue as we move to the Joint Regional Security Stack and eventually into the full Joint Information Environment as our destination, along with the rest of DoD. And that modernization process requires the Coast Guard, as it does others, to make decisions to invest in our networks as strategic assets of the organization with the same level of priority as we do a fleet of cutters, boats, and aircraft, with an understanding that they are necessary for our combat capability, our operational capability, as any of the hard platforms and assets that we use. That we can paint a stripe on those and put the words U.S. Coast Guard on the side. We can't do that with our network infrastructure, but it is no less important to mission success. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. One comment that I was remiss in leaving out when I started, and that is on the 1st of March, in a few weeks here, about a little less than a month now, we're going to be working with the Navy, and we're going to be hosting an event focused on foreign, naval, and maritime threats. And it's a Foreign, Naval, and Maritime Threat Symposium. And hopefully at that symposium, you'll get a little bit more insight on the threats that they're going to be facing, this team up here, as well as the teams that they have within their respective services to move forward. So I would offer that up to you for your consideration. So Admiral Lunday, you mentioned that people were the most important factor at this point in time. So the question I've got is the bar set at the proper level in terms of standards and certifications required to operate the networks? Or put another way, is the bar where it is because that's what we can recruit to and retain?
Would you like me to take that one?
Yeah, sure.
I'm happy to step into that. So I think you're referring to the cybersecurity workforce requirements. Let me address the question a different way. Whether the bar is too high or too low, I don't think we have a choice. We have to maintain a standard that is going to be of skills that are needed for our professionals to operate our networks. And the answer is how we get there. So I think the standards are right. I think what we need to be able to do is adequately resource it and administer it so we can get our folks to get the training that are required in how we get there. So the requirements came out, and it certainly set a lot of questions to the workforce, but I think we've been able to work through it. So that the question is I think the standards, it's not a question of standards, it's how do we manage that right. But I think the imperative is clear. We have to maintain the standards high if we are expected to have the results we need to maintain our networks to the level that they need to be.
Okay, thank you. Admiral
Yes, sir, and I would, just to add on to Admiral Kohler's comments, I think that the standards in the DoD cyberspace workforce model that are put out, that the services are following, provide a baseline floor, if you will, and some of those are very high. But when we talk about combat capability and readiness, we have to think of that in terms of, in the traditional terms of individual, team, unit readiness and what those measures are, and that proficiency at the individual or team or crew level may be something that is higher and more art than the science of a standard or certification that provide maybe perhaps a more objective measure that aligns to some broader industry standards. So I think there are multiple ways in which we have to examine proficiency of the force, and the certifications that are linked to the cyberspace workforce framework are an important way to do that, but not the only way to do that. We have to look at it through traditional readiness measures as well, and proficiency in both the science and the art of that of those disciplines.
Thank you. Dr. Fletcher?
Yeah, so I'd really like to agree with those comments. And I think what we're trying to do in the Department of the Navy is introduce some flexibility, right? We do want folks to have certifications. We're not saying they aren't important or meaningful, but we're expanding the ways that the workforce can meet the credentialing requirements. So they can meet it now by training, they can meet it by education. We're willing to introduce people to the workforce who need these certifications, and then they prove that they have the skills so that they can earn them while they're working with us. So I think this is going to allow us to recruit from a broader part of the population and allow our folks to grow as the certifications change.
You know, another aspect of this. So while we can have the measure of performance that somebody has a certification or take the the procedure book that doctors go through to go show that they've gained a particular proficiency, I think one of the areas that's going to have to mature as we go along is the ability to kind of validate that they can actually apply those skills in some sort of operationally relevant way. And that's something that we probably can use some help in getting after, is how do we actually place the operator into a situation where they have to respond to the threat as they would in real life without putting the network in jeopardy. That's an area that I think we're looking at using the Marine Corps Cyber Range and expanding upon that capability.
You know, there's a lot of talk, thank you very much. There's a lot of talk about operationalizing the network. You hear that all the time. We understand, I think, the value and the importance of the network. I think there's a greater understanding as time goes on. But the question I've got now is, can we afford the network we need? Can we afford the network we need to provide the services and the capabilities? Because a lot of money's been invested, but do you think we can afford the network we need to provide the services and capabilities that the operational forces are going to need going forward? And if not, how do you manage the risk that comes into that?
Yeah, it goes back to the statement before. We've got to resource this in the same way as we look at the other warfighting capabilities. We don't really have a choice. But what we do have a choice with is the technologies that we choose and how we allocate them to the problem, right? So the emerging machine learning and artificial intelligence, how do we take some of the manual tasks that we do today and automate them in the network so that we can free up money that we're spending on labor today to go apply towards the technologies that we need to realize the end state, the objective network.
Yeah, I'd say, it's just kind of where we are in the movie, right? We have the network we have, and this is the network we have to afford. Our choices really going forward is what do we migrate to that might be more affordable at the same time, not as a primary driver, but something that is more defendable and something that is more resilient, moving away from a thick net kind of architecture to thin net, and harnessing smarter technologies in terms of how we defend the network that might be less manpower intensive are certainly areas that we need to go after. But the great news is for the Navy we have this large enterprise network that we can address as a whole. The bad news is we have a large enterprise network that takes a lot of time, and it's a big ship that will turn slowly. Moving it towards something that is more operationally defendable, then more affordable is where I think we need to go.
Any other comments?
Sir, I think when we talk about requirements, affordability, as Admiral Kohler said, has got to be within the list of requirements that we're trying to meet. If you begin the requirements discussion with affordability at the front end of that discussion, you end up in a much different place than if you're trying to build affordability at the back end. And so as we talk about modernizing our networks, what we're doing in the Coast Guard, and I think others are as well, is we're starting to actually write down some of the fundamental assumptions that will underpin our network architecture and the investments. Things that we probably talked around, but we never wrote down before. We probably in the Coast Guard took 1990s era network and computer technology, and we have built and bolted things onto it over the last 20 plus years until it's sort of become, my words, sort of a Frankenstein's monster kind of a thing that we rely on as our primary mission platform for business functions and for operational functions as well. But it was never designed originally for that. And so as we begin to modernize, we need to take some basic assumptions and build those in about affordability, about connectivity. So 20 years ago, we probably made assumptions that we would always be connected everywhere, every time. But that may be optimized for your central business office environment. That is not optimized for the tactical operator at the edge of the enterprise. But that should be where we start our assumptions. And so that puts you in a very different place as you build requirements that way. And again, I think affordability has to be a key part of that early discussion.
Okay, I'm going to open this up for questions in just a minute. So if you'd be thinking about those questions you'd like to ask so that I don't dominate all the questions that are up here. But just a few minutes ago, Ken Bible mentioned some technologies out there. So, I'd like to hear from each of you. What do you see as, and there's certainly a large number, but what do you see as the 2 or 3 most critical technologies needed to fully operationalize the network so that it can reach its maximum potential in terms of a warfighting capability? If you could pick just 2 or 3 technologies, where would you, with what you know now and where you understand where we are now, what would those technologies be?
Okay, I've got one that's near and dear to my heart. It's called free space optics. Something that we've been working on with the Navy Research Lab to come up with an open architecture framework to be able to provide to industry to start building out that capability. So hoping to see the ability to perhaps replace some of our legacy radios or at least give some diversity to our ability to communicate. One exercise that we recently ran out at 29 Palms with this free space optics on the top of a standard Mark 142 mast system. Marines set it up in a relatively short time with very little training on it. In fact, at one point, they just gave them a manual and said, go connect up. I think it took them about 2 minutes. Hank, am I right on that? You remember? It was something like that, it was not a long shot, but the fact that the Marines, with the training they had, were able to set this thing up and get something like 400 gig throughput, I think it was 400 gig, wasn't it? Throughput out of this thing, and they didn't have to have a field service representative helping them set it up. They did it on their own. That's powerful. And so I like the old Karate Kid analogy. If you want to go avoid being hit, don't be there, right? So if you don't want to get hit in the RF spectrum, don't be there.
Anyone else?
Yeah, so that's I didn't even think of that, but I wish I would have, because free space optics are super cool. What I was thinking about was data analytics. So I think now we have a huge amount of data available to us, and we can use it, we can use it to optimize our business operations. We can use it to optimize our cybersecurity posture. We can use it to optimize almost everything we're doing. And I think the Department of the Navy is making big strides on using the data that we have. But I work in the Department of the Navy, and so I know that some of the data we have is printouts in boxes. So I think tools that are going to help us make our data accessible and help us analyze our data and really harness all the data that we own are going to be incredibly valuable. And honestly, I think there's probably 50 tools right now that are really useful and could be very beneficial to us, but tomorrow I think there'll be 50 more. So I don't want to name specific tools, but I think this is a space in which we can make huge strides pretty quickly.
Okay, when you're ready to, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was going to make a comment. Maybe the things that come to my mind, leading organizations that's responsible for manned training and equipping. What comes to my mind is maybe something that's less cool and more pedestrian in some people's mind is we need to deliver better training tools. We need to be able to deliver a tool. I'm thinking of a virtual training type of approach in terms of how we are training a very large IT workforce, our civilians and our sailors. But we're training large numbers of ITs. It's the second largest rate in the Navy. We train them in a schoolhouse on a system, and then we send them out to a ship, and it may be the same system, but it's not the same version that they were trained on. And then we continue to skip ahead with different versions, and the training goes right around them. And they may catch training up again sometime when they PCS again, maybe. We need to deliver a training that can be delivered wherever they are. And there are some examples of where that is being pursued. Spay War, with their cane system, has a virtual trainer that they are testing now that allows the canes to be pushed out to the fleet areas and even afloat in the times when the bandwidth will support it. That will allow the training to occur. The sailors can train wherever they are. And then, no kidding, when the system gets updated, they can train on the new version too. It's a currency issue, but with the pace of change and what we're expecting our IT force to stay on top of, we have got to match the training with it. And any program, certainly the Navy runs, and the pressure comes to deliver the capability. When the program gets pressurized, and it always does, the first thing that falls out of that is the training. And what we have is a tool that is not used to its full intent because we're not training to it. So to me, a virtual training tool capability that runs alongside of anything new that's delivered to the fleet.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. Nick Drzezinski, CSRA. I just wanted to thank you for the discussion, and we're very pleased to be able to be a sponsor today. So it occurs to me that the theme and the distillation of a lot of the comments is around the interdependency of the various network types and the applications running on them, and everyone's in violent agreement as to how those merge to become the weapon system that we need them to be together. What occurs to me, though, is, and we see this as a provider on OneNet for sure, that parts of that network are administrative, other parts are very much C2 elements. But across all of the fabric that we're discussing, some of those things we procure as weapon systems, and some of those things we very clearly don't. So I was
There we go.
Okay. I think your question was, do we need to change the way we're buying IT systems? Because I think I heard you say we're buying some things as weapon systems, some things not.
right.
And I guess from my perspective, I think, yeah, we do have to change the way we think about it. So back 15, 20 years ago, there was a DoD instruction around portfolio management. And so these various programs, the money flow came down through various sponsorships. So DCMO was headed with the responsibility for the business missionary and for the business systems. CIO was headed with the enterprise IT systems, EIEMA portfolio. Intel, it was OSDI that had it. Long story short, we've got a money trail for spending against programs. I think part of what I see, and this is my personal opinion, in what was being initially pulled together around JIE was getting ourselves back in alignment so that those other mission areas actually landed on top of the EIEMA portfolio, right, which was kind of the original construct. But because the EIEMA layer wasn't available, we ended up with programs building the whole stack, which is the reason we're chasing data centers and the reason that we're chasing after applications that don't behave very well in the tactical environment. So I agree we've got to do something different, but there's some foundation work that probably has to get done, and that's some of the work that we're all kind of dealing with right now. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much.
Over here, and then we'll come to you.
Yes. Sidney Friedberg, Breaking Defense. One of the recurring themes we've seen all day today is great power competition, preparing for great power competition, getting ready for that, extreme scenario. Of course, for you all, it's a bit different because the advanced persistent threat is actually there now in peacetime, quote unquote peacetime. And to some degree, even in the RF spectrum, EW activity is happening in peacetime. If you listen to the Russians, they can magically shut down Aegis from a distance, for example. Not sure I quite buy that. But how is the network defending itself against near-peer threats right now in both cyber and the spectrum? And how do you train, prepare for the escalation of that would actually come with a conflict, or perhaps even a gray zone kind of conflict before there's actually, officially a shooting war?
I'll take a stab at the first one. So, Sydney, thanks. Great question. I would ask you to probably hold that question if you're going to attend the panel that Admiral Gilday will be attending that talks about operating in the gray areas. I think we'll specifically get at that. I'll answer it a different way. I'll say as a fallout or result of the comprehensive review, the study that was done, looking at the readiness of our operating forces following the series of mishaps and collisions in the Western Pacific. And the report is pretty broad and comprehensive, and I certainly won't try and describe it here. But certainly an element of what they found in terms of causal factors was these forward deployed forces that were always operating. Over time, the demand signal was rising, and they found in units being in a constantly operating mode that a creeping in philosophy that perhaps since they're always operating, maybe they don't need to train so much, or maybe it became less important. And that's something they would get to when they were done operating, and they saw some of the skills dropping because of that. In my discussions that I've had as a result of comprehensive review, our information warfare operating forces, these are ones that operate in our comm centers, in our Navy Information Operations Centers, our intel centers. They're constantly operating too. They're operating in a 24/7 basis that are tied to operating forces connected routinely. So as a TICOM that's responsible for their readiness, this path that we have been on is how do we ensure that their training is maintained while they're operating at a constant level. And we have been introducing a number of different initiatives. An example of one is ultra teams that go in that monitor watch teams' ability to respond to different pre-planned responses or crisis operations and grade them in terms of how well they're actually operating. So we don't have teams within their own commands grading their own homework. But it's a chance to try and carve some time out with these forces that are always operating and really try to get a sense of how good are they really and are they maintaining their training standards. So it's very much a different kind of operating environment that we're in, and these forces that we have operating continuously aren't in a readiness deployment, come back from deployment, reset, retrain type of cycle that our afloat forces do. And so the training that's required for those to maintain their readiness in this constantly contested environment is different. So I'm back to the training theme that I highlighted in my previous comment was how do we provide the training in a highly adaptable way, but one that we can provide for our forces that are always operating. We just can't pull them off the line. We can't have a comm center stop operating because we want to take them down for a couple of weeks to train. So it requires a different kind of approach. And for us to be good at what we do, the training has to be world-class as well.
Anyone else?
I would just add to Admiral Kohler's comments about the readiness of our personnel. If we think about our networks within the DoD information networks and our subcomponent of that for the Coast Guard, we are engaged in a process to, well, if we think about cyberspace as an operational domain, think of our ability to not just harden the network, but to actually shape the terrain itself by taking actions that put us in a position to be less responsive or reactive and more proactive. So in other words, actions that we are taking to harden the networks are preventive in nature, so that if we do detect a threat, we start from a position of greater advantage to be able to respond to and defeat that threat inside the network. And so being able to maneuver the terrain or the network itself, not just maneuver inside of it, but maneuver the network or maneuver the terrain, is an important concept that we've been working to apply to put ourselves in a position of greater advantage and greater overmatch on threats we may detect in the network.
Yes, sir.
Good afternoon, Lieutenant Commander Ty, Combined Information Systems Officer at USS Boxer. My question is, with the various different flavors of enterprise networks that we're facing here, from LtGen, OneNet, Compose, Canes, the Marine Corps networks, has there been look at approaching a single common environment designed from the ground up to meet distance to data requirements, security requirements that are currently not met by our float forces? Perhaps using thin clients to minimize the amount of maintenance and effort required by the sailors. That way, across all the Coast Guard, Navy, Marine Corps training venues, we have a single course of instruction and a single course of maintenance.
Excuse me, I'm going to jump in on that. That's my question, which is, it's been dismaying to listen to the friction internal to the network across from different ships in the Marine Corps, different systems, systems being fielded and then reverse engineered to figure out how to talk to the rest of the network. So if one of the former chairmen said we're supposed to fight more networked, but be prepared to be unnetworked, I don't see that happening. So I want to jump on that and double down on that and say, what are we doing to get a network that actually talks to each other on the front end instead of trying to constantly reverse engineer something that someone just bought?
I'll take a stab at it. Some of this has to do with what can you afford and how quickly you think you want to get there. I think each of the services have a different operating environment in terms of how they operate. Doesn't mean that we have different systems, but this is where we've evolved from. There are some places that we are going to that's more commonized. It was mentioned with the JIE type of approach to us, gets us to some aspect, gives us a more of a common platform across the services where it makes sense. There are unique aspects. I'll tell you, the Navy will be in there for a long, long time, as long as we have these great things that float, that have, frankly, just different operating demand signal. I'm talking to the commo on the Boxer here that knows that. Very different requirements, and I think we might be that. I think there are some initiatives that are moving us towards a commonizing architecture at some level. I am fully on board with some of the frustrations that you're feeling. When I talked about how I defined the networks, which was more than the IP networks that you mentioned, it was everything that comes together with the links, the RF nets, all of that. For every deploying strike group and every deploying amphibious ready group, I have a team called a DG-SIT, the Deploying Group Systems Integration Team, that we're paying well over $1 million per strike group. This is a 50 or 60 man team that we cherry pick talent out of our syscoms and others that are experts in their own systems and get them on board these platforms just to get the systems to work together the way they're supposed to. While this might not have been important the last 15 or 20 years, the kind of threats that we are facing today, and we're preparing our forces to operate in, all of that has to work. It will be little things that will kill us. All those things have to come and work. By the time these units get into their COM2X towards the end of the COM2X, they're in a much better place. We should not have to do that. The reason why we're doing these DG-SITs is because the highly complex nature of what we put together, Frankenstein, some of them comes to mind, but they're not being delivered in the way that they is supposed to interoperate. So I'm on board with your comments. These are conversations that I have with my Syscom counterparts to push for a much more interoperable type of warfighting platform.
Thank you, sir.
So, you could play off that too, and you could take it to the joint force as a whole, right? Yes, sir.
Well, can I jump on that for a second, right? So it goes a little bit back to the applications and the things that we're putting on board, right? So we're seeing some of that friction come from the fact that these systems were kind of designed around given functional communities' requirements. They weren't necessarily designed to land on common infrastructure. So even getting things to run in canes, right? There's a lot of work to go bring a system up so where it can actually ride in that common computing environment. From a Marine Corps perspective, we are trying to go unify the Marine Corps Enterprise Network and take all those different segments and things that split off because of our need to go deploy out for Iraq and Afghanistan that couldn't be supported by what was then NMCI. A lot of work. I think my Navy counterparts likewise have been working to kind of pull those networks in and kind of standardize all those things that they have in their inventory that they were trying to standardize. So a lot of that heat and light and friction is driven by those activities. So it may be good to look at that as a sign of progress because we're actually looking at it now rather than having it hide underneath the covers.
Hi, I'm Mike Gruss with C4ISRNet. I wanted to follow up on the question about affording the network. Could anyone speak broadly as to what types of technologies you're considering outside of the cloud and outside of artificial intelligence that help make your networks more affordable? I'm looking for some examples there. And then the second part of my question is, do you have the resources to do that, or are some of those costs being taken by hardening systems and hardening the network for cybersecurity because that's the first priority?
So it's interesting that I often hear from colleagues a discussion about, hey, are we going to spend this year's resources on more cybersecurity and hardening, or are we going to spend it on utility? And what I've been trying to drive the discussion, and I think we've had some success, is that that is not an either-or proposition. That if you're after utility for mission assurance, the security is inherent in that utility. And so it's about reframing that discussion. And if we're going to talk about affordability, we're in that space. We've been in that space. We're not going to leave that space for a long time. Affordability is always going to increase in terms of being a driver of requirements. In terms of what things we haven't talked about, that what we may need, I will tell you in the last 4 or 5 months, one of the Coast Guard's most significant operations we were involved in, that many of you are aware, were the historic hurricanes that impacted Texas, Florida, and Puerto Rico, and some additional states on the Gulf Coast. And we learned some things from that. We're still capturing some of those lessons, but we learned, for example, we had been on a path to rid most of our what I would call contingency communications capability, our mobile contingency communications capability, which we had not used for a significant operation for some time. And we had not divested of that capability, but we realized in the middle of those hurricanes just how critical it was to essential operations. And the 3 words I came out of that significant sustained operation for the Coast Guard was reliable, operational, mobility. And I think that is going to drive for our service a renewed discussion about requirements, because each one of those words is loaded: reliable, operational, mobility, and should drive in maybe ways it hasn't in the past what our investments should be going forward to ensure that what we are delivering for our operators at the tactical edge in different environments in which they can no longer rely on commercial or other types of communications that they depend on in a normal everyday situation. But in a contingency, they need reliable communications to be able to provide to that operational tactical edge. that's going to force us into a discussion about requirements in a way that we have not been able to have short of that contingency forcing it.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Lieutenant Commander Mozzini from Com 3rd Fleet. We hear a lot about the fleet tactical grid, merging C2 and business systems, and we're spending a lot of money, time, training on systems designed in a system high architecture. What do you see as either the policy or technology things that need to change for us to move to a data-centric network environment where I can then, as Admiral Lunday said, really mimic that human network where I can, share data appropriately, seamlessly across the joint force, our coalition partners, NGOs, the people who need the data in the operation.
Yeah, so that's a question that I think we're still struggling to answer, and I think it's actually an initiative that's being taken by DoD CIO. So even outside the Navy, this is a priority. Mission partner environment is one of the big priorities of the DoD CIO, and that's really going to help us share information with our mission partners, with I think NGOs, and do so in a more elegant way at also a better price, frankly. And the Navy is participating in developing that and trying to figure out how to deploy it. Truthfully, it's going to be a year. It's going to be some time before we see it come to fruition. We do have pilots going on with it right now. So for the mission partner portion of your question, I think mission partner environment is the answer right now.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for being here today. Thank you for the service to our country and to all of our warfighters. Dr. Fletcher, you made a comment, and I'm trying to paraphrase here, that industry and government roles are different for your two different types of networks, one being, I think, the business side and the other being the tactical side. And I heard the Deputy Secretary of Defense this morning talk about how we need to get industry more engaged. And so I'd like to, first of all, know why they're different and in what way, because it seems to me that a lot of us that are in industry used to be wearing the uniforms, and many of us have scar tissue from the previous networks that we tried to develop and that didn't necessarily flourish as well as they should. So could you just tell us, one, in what way in what way are they different in terms of industry's engagement in those two networks, and why?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm really happy you brought up the deputy's remarks this morning. So I think that there are some activities that are inherently governmental. And I think, operating offensively on the network is one of those activities to some degree. I think that we're actually still working to define what roles and responsibilities we have with industry, right? So I would say from my perspective, 5 years ago, we assumed that 90% of activities were inherently governmental in cybersecurity, in cyber defense, in cyber offense. I think as time has passed, we're becoming more and more open to industry taking over some of these roles and responsibilities. So I think this is a moving target. But I do think that right now, if we're using some networks for things other than business operations, we may want to have a different role. And we're still defining that. And certainly that network where we would have different requirements with respect to resiliency. So I think this is something we actually want to partner with industry to figure out what can you provide, what can we provide, how do we do this together in the most cost-effective and sensible way.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take a little bit different vector on this next question, only because this morning and last night I had three different individuals come up to me. One was a gentleman from PACOM, another one from UCOM, and they were strongly concerned about the radio frequency spectrum and our ability to operate in that spectrum. It has just become so congested, and the impact of some of the capabilities that are being delivered to our men and women don't have authority to operate in some countries because of the spectrum rules. So how do how do we work through that issue? I mean, we've got the same issue right here in the United States, much less going to other countries. So if you're going to adapt commercial technologies within a given radio frequency spectrum band, you know, is this come as you are and we're just going to knock in the door, or what are we going to do?
Okay, so I actually think spectrum, the new technologies we're harnessing for spectrum are going to allow us to use a broader part of the spectrum. So this is a real concern. This is a problem in the field right now. It's going to be a problem in the future as we sell spectrum. But I do think that as we buy new systems, these systems operate in a much wider range of frequencies. And that allows us to make requests for frequency assignments in places that we haven't previously. It's still going to be complicated. The other thing is that I think as we harness technology, we're going to be able to use smaller chunks of the spectrum. So just like my cell phone can now download data, and this is new, I think we're going to see that with our tactical communications as well. We're going to use less of the spectrum to complete the same tasks. The other thing is, as Ken mentioned, free space optics. I think we're just going to expand our use of what's available, the available resource, and expand into places we haven't been yet.
Any other thoughts?
Just to carry on to that, right? So spectrum coordination or international frequency coordination has always been kind of a challenging thing when we want to train or we need to operate. Well, not so much if we are in combat operations, but certainly in terms of training. And the great thing, going back to the free space optics, and one of the things that made me a believer was the fact that there is no coordination required. It's out of that area wherein the spectrum coordination is required. So, but I think, as Dr. Fletcher points out, we've got to figure out where can we coexist, particularly in some of these commercial technologies that are widely used. I believe we probably have to take a very critical eye towards what we are willing to go sell in the future, because this is not going to stop. I think that industry wants to use the spectrum, and by and large, there's some real merit in it. But there are some systems that are harder to go move than others. Some of our warfare systems to re-engineer to operate in other spectrum is a pretty tremendous burden. Some of on the comm side, some of that's a little bit more adaptable, but it still takes a bunch of money. You don't just go put a new frequency into a radio without having some cost associated with it.
Yeah, I'll add some comments to that. So one of the commands I have 80 commands responsible. One of them is the Navy Marine Corps Spectrum Command that lives this wonderful challenge every day in terms of every event that we have, every exercise, every certifying event for our fleet. Gets into very finite detail in terms of where we're operating in the spectrum. So the spectrum's a pretty big place, right? So is the ocean. But when you get down to just a few places that boats travel, it gets pretty darn congested. And it's the same way with the spectrum. We're all operating very tightly, and I agree with the comments here. It's going to get increasingly congested, especially if we're looking at selling off parts of the spectrum that DoD likes to operate in. And so currently that requires just a lot of push-ups in terms of coordinating. That requires a lot of coordination with our foreign partners, particularly when we have have bases in their countries. We've seen where it works well, and sometimes it doesn't, and then we have to adjust. And so we do. That's the problem we have. How well we're walking that back to the acquisition side of the house, that looks in terms of where we operate, what spectrum the capabilities we're producing is. I think that conversation probably is happening, and it should happen. But I would put it in priority order. What do we need to deliver the best warfighting capability? What spectrum should that be? And then let's have a conversation about how we manage that. I would want to put the warfighting capability first, not worries about the spectrum deconfliction. If that's operating in phase 0, that's one thing. If we're operating in a phase 2 conflict mode, we're probably going to worry a little bit less about spectrum pieces to it. But I will tell you, there's a lot of work that happens on a routine basis that allows us to operate in our current congested environment. the last piece I'll talk about that is back to I'll call it some of the training conversations I'm having here, where the Navy's going with a live, virtual, and constructed type of training. This is kind of the innovative training that I'm talking about. Not all training has to be live. We can't walk away from live training. That's not what I'm saying. But there are times when it makes sense to create a virtual kind of construct that allows sailors to operate at their consoles the way they normally would in a virtual environment. Some of it's constructed. How we're operating in some of the spectrum that we've been talking about probably makes sense. And that's kind of where we are and frankly, a direction that the Navy's going to maximize that type of more innovative training approach that allows us to maintain proficiencies while not burning up platforms in a live environment.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask one final question unless someone else wants to take it. Okay, where are the seams in the network that need to be focused on to conduct effective amphibious operations?
I think that one lands on me a little bit, right? You'll help? Okay, very good. So this is kind of, this is near and dear. I talked about that, the pacing threat. We talk about the challenges that we face and the fact that this is a naval fight inherently, right? It's a Navy Marine Corps team. One of the things that is that we're trying to noodle through is how do we make sure that as we build the Marine Corps Enterprise Network, which I'm trying to go, and what we're trying to go get at is that Marine could take the computer off their desk, get on the back of the MV-22 and go down range. Same machine. And they have consistency of the services across that environment. So that interface is when they get on a ship. And I don't want to bring anything on the ship with me if I don't have to, because I'd rather carry the gear that I'm going to go ashore with. So the challenge is figuring out how do we do that most effectively. And it's been, we talked about the DG sits before. We participated some with that. I think that's probably an area to continue to grow that interface and figure out what works best. Some interesting things happened as we've tried to go press Win 10, not just across the garrison, but across the entirety of the Marine Corps Enterprise Network. When we got on the ship, some things stopped working. So because we were kind of leaning forward on the Windows 10, we found ourselves having to bring some additional gear in order to go get underway.
Yeah, how dare you bring a Windows 10 platform onto a Navy ship?
Sorry about that, Admiral. But we're bringing more. So.
Yeah, I mentioned the DG sits, and I think it's an example to talk about where there's some good work being done here. We also, for every Marine Expeditionary Unit that's working up to deploy with the ARG, we do a DG sit just with their ground equipment, the stuff that will disembark and go ashore to help them with their interoperability issues with the gear that they have. Then they'll bring their gear on board that interfaces and plugs in with the ship, and that's part of the DG sit too. And how that interfaces and plugs in with when the MU staff comes in, all the different elements of the MU that comes on board, that has to integrate well. That's not without its push-ups either. We've highlighted some friction points that we've had to overcome. But I think, at least within the naval forces, we've been able to work that out. So if you want to highlight a seam, that's one of them. But it's one I think that we're handling well.
And then we get into joint operations, we get even more complex, correct? Okay, thank you.
I would like to thank, on behalf of USNI and AFCEA, the audience for being with us today, for the questions, good tough questions. You asked for them to challenge you. I think we did. Thanks for the expertise and insights you offered today. Very helpful as we address the topic of leveraging the network in this near-peer or peer competition. We are going to present to each member of the panel from the Naval Institute a book, Cyberspace in Peace and War by Martin Libicki, with an AFCEA bookmark. I promise you I'll hand it as you leave the stage to you, and you can have your own copy of it. To all of you, we'd like to invite you to the reception that follows here. Thanks to CSRA, Leidos, and DXC for their sponsorship of that. See you tomorrow at 8:30 as we have Lieutenant General Stephen Rudder, first presentation in the theater. As you leave, CSRA, thank you for your sponsorship. I've got something for you on the way out. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the event. Thank you.